But first, a special edition of Beat the Press with our good friend and sometimes, well, he's the business and environment reporter for American Family News, onenewsnow.com. He also tag teams the anchoring position with the likes of Chad Groening and others who step in. His name, Chris Woodward. And what's his Twitter?
Yeah, thank you. You can find me on Twitter at AFNC Woodward. That was a good segment you just had on your show.
Wow, it just felt charged up. He's a great guest and some wonderful work they're doing at Watchmen on the Wall. I know American Family Association is a part of that. I know, obviously, AFR Talk is. We're on site, and it's great. Great job to everybody locking that in and making that happen. Thank you. Let's move here, Chris, to NBC and the report on the threat to Lady Liberty herself. Interesting on climate change. You actually covered this in a story this week as well on the landmarks, which was a great story. But here's the report. Everybody get ready to truly drink this one in because it's climate scare tactics on steroids. Roll it.
There's a new report out tonight about the long-term effects of climate change on some great American treasures, dozens of them across the country that might one day be something we read about in history books rather than places we visit. We get our report tonight from our chief environmental affairs correspondent, Ann Thompson.
It's that time of year when families pile into the car to discover America. Yet some of the sites that tell the story of our past face a present and future threat. Wildfires, floods, and sea level rise that the Union of Concerned Scientists says are driven by climate change.
There are going to be places that we learn about in school that we will no longer be able to visit or see in the future unless we do something about this problem.
Today's report lists 30 sites, including Jamestown, Virginia. Barely above sea level, the report says the first English colony could be underwater by the turn of the century. At the Kennedy Space Center, storm surges now threaten the launch pads that sent Americans to the moon. Near Yosemite, the gold rush town of Groveland, California, already faces warmer, drier summers, increasing the wildfire risk.
Because we've identified some of the most places at most risk, we can take steps now to try to preserve our national heritage. And so that's encouraging.
This is how Hollywood envisioned the future of the Statue of Liberty. Today's report says the real threat is rising waters. Here's what 5 feet of sea level rise would look like. 2 years ago, Superstorm Sandy delivered a real-life preview of coming attractions, forcing Liberty Island to temporarily close.
This room was completely flooded all the way up to here.
And ending a 200-year tradition of people living on the island. The report praises that decision and the relocation of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, moved more than a half-mile to protect it from an eroding coast in 1999, planning for nature's increasing unpredictability to preserve our nation's past.
I believe they used that one film the day after.
They did, yes.
Wow. Tell me something, Chris. That seems to me to be, at best, irresponsible.
That was some fancy editing. For sure, yeah, but you know, it does what they probably wanted, where it was gonna get some shock and awe for you, and you know they probably teased it, which is a lingo for the television world, where you try to get some people to watch and things of that sort. But yeah, it's definitely a scary story, if you want to call it that. USA Today was one of those that got in on the action earlier this week. They had national landmarks threatened by climate change, and they too had a picture of the Statue of Liberty, which was one of the landmarks that was supposedly under threat by the Union of Concerned Scientists. That is a group that has long believed in climate change. They say it's real, it's happening, it's going to get worse. You know, the stuff they're warning about right here points out places. For instance, they said Jamestown was already barely above sea level. That's true. But if you really look at a lot of the monuments in these areas, the places they're warning about, they're places that are already in areas where climate does some really climate-y stuff, weather issues and whatnot. And as a result, a lot of people are kind of dismissing this particular report, not just because it's from the Union of Concerned Scientists, although that is one issue. Chip Knappenberger over at the Cato Institute, who has a background in environmental sciences, basically said the same thing. There's a tendency to confuse the impacts of climate with the impacts of human-caused climate change. And he tells USA Today, quote, "This most certainly is taking place in the UCS report." I talked with Mark Morano of Climate Depot fame. People would know that name if they follow this issue. He says this is basically just silly. It's nonsense. And it's not even peer-reviewed, which USA Today did point that out. That's interesting because people who say climate change is real, it's happening, and it's going to get worse, tend to point to things as being peer-reviewed when they're making their points. This particular publication was not peer-reviewed, so it'll be interesting to see how they handle that going forward.
Well, it seems that they could have handled it with some other type of reference as opposed to just, I'm going to scare you.
Right. Right, and we've seen a number of these warnings over in recent years. Probably more so in recent years, but certainly they go back decades. Everybody talks about how they saw pictures and magazine articles back in the 70s warning of an ice age. The Daily Caller actually took those kinds of issues on earlier this year. The Daily Caller, a guy named Mike Bastach. He wrote an article, a headline was Top 5 Failed Snow-Free and Ice-Free Predictions, one of which, Crane, you'll remember this one. Al Gore's fear-mongering that the ice caps would be melted at this point and we'd all be underwater and all that stuff. Certainly, that was several years ago at this point, and it still hasn't happened. Matter of fact, another article from Mike Bastach actually talks about the levels of ice on the ice cap. So,
real quick question.
Okay.
Al Gore, what question would you ask him if you had the opportunity, if you actually took a question and was held accountable by somebody who absolutely did have a different point of view, or at least we're going to hold him to account for his fails?
How much money have you made on the products and services that you've been pushing, and what are you going to do with that money?
Wow. And I just put Chris on the spot. He delivers every time.
Woodward he's made a nice chunk of change, more so than $15 an hour. I can tell you that.
Yeah, and by the way, great reporting on that. Let's hear Carol Costello.
Okay.
We could say jump the shark, but that happened a long time ago. She's of CNN, and she had two clerical guests, actually. Reverend Mitchell Hescox from the Evangelical Environmental Network and CNN's religion commentator, Father Edward Beck. Here's the report. Roll it.
Reverend Hescox, can't we just say it like it is? Climate change deniers aren't listening to scientists, or they're not reading the Bible. They're denying global warming for purely political reasons, right?
It's going to take all of America to come together to battle it. That's why the comments of Mr. Sajak yesterday, even in sarcasm, were hurtful. And I want to pray and lift him up, because we need to get over this angry hatredness and really turn to following the God that I know best in Christ and his love and leading us out of climate change.
Father Beck, there's a 97% consensus among scientific experts that humans are causing global warming. Now, religious leaders like Pope Francis say we have a moral responsibility to take care of the planet. You say if we don't, we're sinners. Is that right?
As we're stewards of creation, we need to care for it. This is God's gift to us. And if you abuse it, then you're really maligning that gift.
Now, Pat Sajak of Wheel of Fortune fame tweeted a statement regarding global warming, and I think I don't have it in front of me. My apologies, Chris. But what was cracking me up about this was he tweets this message, and I'm pulling it up right now. Thought it was in the story. Here he is. I now believe global warming alarmists are unpatriotic racists knowingly misleading for their own ends. Good night. Okay?
Yes.
Now, okay, I laughed at that. Your thoughts on the reporting of this, courtesy of Newsbusters, last two clips, and Carol Costello's framing and the response from the clerical community?
Let's begin with the first thing there. The personality on CNN, we've talked about her before. She mentioned she made a comment that how climate change deniers are not reading the Bible. There are climate change deniers that do read the Bible that point out things like this. Genesis 1:28, that's when God says he blesses man and says unto him, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it. What does subdue mean? One definition is overcome, quiet, or quieten or bring under control. In other words, we have the gift from God to overcome, bring under control this gift of creation that the priest talked about there. And certainly the comments that the gentleman made to her in reference to her question could very well go to her. She was pretty harsh in her commentary there to evoke a response, perhaps. But certainly what he said about Mr. Sajak, he could probably pray for her too.
Well said. And speaking of praying, part 2, roll it.
It's easy to blow off comments like, Pat Sajak's tweet, but tweets like that resonate among some people. So, Father Beck, what would you like to say to Pat Sajak?
Well, what's interesting to me is the racist, unpatriotic, how you link the two. I think the argument could be made that it is more racist to deny climate change because those being affected by it are the poor. The global poor are affected most by climate change, not the rich who can afford air conditioning and get around all the deleterious effects of climate change.
I would say ask the left. They're always accusing conservatives. Okay, go ahead. Also, by the way, I want to point out E. Calvin Beisner of the Cornwall Alliance this week, Biblical Perspective Foundation. We had him on disputing the climate change, man-made climate change advocates and evidence, and he did so very well.
Right, and the priest there, the father,
yes,
as she identified him, he talks about basically rich folks and poor folks. That's an issue you'll see a lot in these kinds of stories, and there are members of the faith community across a number of denominations or churches who have been calling for a redistribution of the wealth, which is, again, something that skeptics tend to point out this is what this stuff is really all about.
And population control. It's statism. Yes. All right, for purposes of time, we go to ABC News. George Stephanopoulos' reflections on the president's comments yesterday that drew outrage from even Democrats not responding passionately enough. Roll it.
President Obama with his most forceful statements yet on the growing controversy at the VA health centers. He says the allegations of misconduct are dishonorable, disgraceful, will not be tolerated. He also, however, did deny any link between these waiting lists and the allegations, especially at the VA facility in Arizona, and any deaths. A whistleblower had alleged that up to 40 deaths had been linked to these waiting lists, the president denying any link.
Chris, real quick, we pointed this out last night with Jessie Jane Duff. I referenced it specifically of the episodic remark as opposed to conditioned. We do have that evidence. As a journalist, you have that evidence. What are we missing?
An actual factual response from Jay Carney. That's what we're missing. This story is going to be continuing for a while, and the White House certainly is not helping the situation. Because their response to this particular scandal, and it is a scandal because of how veterans were treated and are being treated, they have given the same exact response to this that they have given everything, that the president is mad, he's going to get to the bottom of it, and people are going to be punished. And we've seen in those instances, people haven't been brought to justice. There are doubts that anything substantial will be done this time around.
Are you taken aback? We're gonna stop the clip just for time purposes. Are you taken aback by the fact that our president learned about the most recent scandal or elements of the scandal, the waitlist scandal, people dying attributed to the waitlist, not getting the care, 40 in Phoenix?
That he learned from the news reports? That shows that he is out of touch, because remember, he wasn't aware of some of the problems, and he said as much going into the launch of healthcare.gov. And he blamed it on somebody else, which shows you that he does one of two things. He is the deferrer-in-chief. In other words, he says, that's your responsibility, you go handle this. That way, when things do go terribly wrong, as they often do in politics, in Washington in general, R's or D's, the president, whoever is in that position, can have some sort of like plausible deniability. And that is often shown to be a lack of real leadership, that he's not really in tune with all this stuff. Talking about climate change and these cultural landmarks, today, Crane, the president was hitting up cultural landmarks, talking about how we need to bring in, tourism. Hey, if you're outside the U.S., come tour our historic landmarks. A day after people are concerned about cultural landmarks going away because of climate change.
Chris Woodward, some great work this week. Your top of the hour, or I assume we'll hear about it again, obviously, but the report on the unions, the IRS, that's a developing story,
Yes.
and you're on it.
Yeah.
Wow. Great work in covering the protests. We really appreciate it. It's business and environment reporter and anchor tag teaming with the great Chad Groening,
Right.
onenewsnow.com. Your Twitter.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at AFNC Woodward, and One News Now has an account as well.
We could just do 3 hours ourselves on all this stuff. You're great, man. Appreciate you.
All right.
Have a wonderful weekend. God bless.
See ya.
Take care. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. Aaron Free next. AFR Talk.